views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.
Hello, Philippines. This is LeCain with World News Jam. We bring you the most interesting stories from around the world each week. We just don't give you the news, but we tell you the story behind the news, as well as read and answer your questions in an entertaining and easy to understand way. So please join us on DZRJ 810 AM Radio Bandito TV and get yourself updated with all the interesting news of the week from around the world right here on DZRJ's World News Jam.
Watch and listen to World News Jam, Saturdays, 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. Airing on Sky Cable Channel 224 and on all DTT boxes. Simulcasting online on Facebook and YouTube. Listen and watch on your mobile devices. Just search DZRJ Radio Bandido.
Hello, Philippines, and welcome to the World News Jam here on DZRJ 810 AM and Radio Bandito TV Channel 224 right here in the city of Manila. My name is LeCain. We bring you what I think are the most interesting stories of the week, keeping you updated on all the biggest news going on outside the Philippines. Now, this week, I give you an update on the giant storm in the southern region of the U.S. and why it might have happened in the first place. Also, is there an all-out war going on in the Middle East, and who's joining up for the fight? Racism in Asia, is it getting worse in China? Some space news from about 15 billion miles away, and of course our ongoing coverage of the U.S. election. How was that vice presidential debate, and did anyone care? So let's get to it. You know, I have seen storms, and I have seen some storms. I saw Yolanda now. That was pretty bad. I lived through Odette, which took out most of the windows in my house. I even was around during Katrina. But something about the latest storm in the U.S. that just seems different. Last week, a storm called Helena ripped through the southeast part of the United States. Now, during the show last Saturday, the storm was happening as I was talking. Part of the reason I knew so many details is that's where I'm from, where I grew up. So I was talking to the people as it was passing through the area. This was before all the cell phones went down. So I wanted to update you a bit on what happened since last week. What seems so different about this storm is that it really changed the landscape of the area. Mostly in storms, they blow down houses and topple trees. But in this one, whole pieces of land have been moved. The storm hit in a mountain region, so there were places that whole parts of the mountain just broke off. This is why we keep hearing the words isolated cities. Places where there is, because of the storm, no way in or out of the city, where the roads are just not blocked, they are gone entirely. Even the dirt that they sat on is now gone. Now, as of last week, a few had died, but as of now, there are near 200 confirmed deaths and just as many missing. The confirmed dead are in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Many of the deaths are just random. Tree fell on a house. Car was washed away. The one I don't understand is the people killed while hiking. Who hikes during a massive hurricane? Many of the ones that didn't make it are, of course, the rescuers, people trying to save people and themselves becoming the victim. 2 firefighters in South Carolina, one 35-year veteran from the department. The other was an 18-year-old, just started at the fire department. They were in their fire engine when a tree fell on it. A woman in North Carolina Sheriff's Department was driving to work in the storm when a dam broke. Her car was just swallowed up. Also in North Carolina, a deputy was on his lunch break, was in his car when it was swept away. A call came into his office that a car was sinking in the river and someone was inside. It was him. He was not recovered until the next day. A fire chief from Georgia was in his rescue truck when a tree fell on it, killing him instantly. These were just the first responders that were killed. Doesn't include any of the horrific stories that keep coming across the news wire. Like a great-grandfather, 72, and his grandson, 10, died in their home when a tree fell on their house. And there was a retired couple, their home, both dead from a falling tree. When they pulled back the debris, turns out they died in each other's arms sitting on the couch. There is story after story like this. Storm hit in the mountains, huge trees everywhere. They are saying this is one of the most powerful storms to ever hit the U.S., and clearly the most powerful to hit that particular area of the mountains. I mean, I've lived my whole life there, and I have never seen anything even close to this. The hurricane was 420 miles wide. Some places got 20 inches of rain in just a day. The surges and the flood were so fast and powerful that it was nearly impossible to rescue people. In Tennessee, 58 patients and the staff were stranded on the rooftop of the pouring rain. They were surrounded by floods and high winds. No boats or helicopters could risk trying to rescue them. There was a family in Florida that started putting their things up on a table and putting things on the bed. Then came a loud bang. The whole house filled up with water in seconds as it was lifted off of its foundation and started to move. They grabbed the dogs and swam out of one of the windows of the house. Now, President Biden visited the area in a helicopter over Georgia. He said, as we mourn the lives of those who were taken by this storm, I urge folks to heed the direction of local officials and take every precaution to keep themselves and their families safe. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, the two candidates for president, also went to Georgia. Harris saying, we are here for the long haul. There's a lot of work that's going to need to happen over the coming days, weeks, and months. And the coordination that we have dedicated ourselves will be long-lasting to get families, to get residents, to get neighborhoods back up and running. Now, Donald Trump, on the other hand, took a different approach. During his visit, he accused President Biden and his administration for failing to deliver the aid needed by the Georgia community, a claim disputed by the Republican governor there. He suggested that Biden was sleeping and then took time to criticize Harris for being at a fundraiser during the storm. He sent out a tweet saying that the Biden administration and Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina are only helping Democrat areas and are going out of their way not to help Republicans in the state, even though there is no evidence of this at all. Harris, meanwhile, canceled several campaign events to meet with FEMA, sent out a fundraising email directing their supporters to contribute to the disaster relief effort. In the meantime, a consortium of scientists has already come out to say that the reason behind the power of this storm is the extreme high temperature of the water in the Gulf of Mexico. The water temperature should not be as high as it is. According to them, this was caused by human-produced global warming. And because of the hotness of the waters in that area, the more water is absorbed into the atmosphere. According to the Lawrence Berkeley lab in California, they can show that 50% more water came down in rain in Georgia and North Carolina because of the amount absorbed into the air, and they can measure that fairly accurately based on the temperature. For every 1 degree of Fahrenheit or warming, the atmosphere holds 4% more moisture. There were parts of rural North Carolina that got in the neighborhood of 40 inches of rain during that storm. That's in places that don't normally have that much in the whole year. So that has basically totally screwed up the average rainfall numbers. So now we are starting to understand in the simplest reasons for why all of a sudden the storm seems so much worse than, well, ever. Like I have said before, we can survive a few degrees hotter weather, but can we survive the effects of that hotter weather? And as of today, well, neither could around 200 people. So sad. This is LeCain on the World News Jam right here in DZRJ Radio. Okay, let's move over to the super big story of the week, the Middle East. Last week, we delved a bit deeper into the bombs Israel hid inside pagers and walkie-talkies and talked about the Houthi missile that came out of Yemen heading toward Tel Aviv. I asked the question, if a war was developing between Israel and the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and what would Iran's involvement be since Iran supports Hezbollah? Well, this week, that question has been answered. Israel slammed Lebanon with missiles and artillery and eventually killed all the senior leadership of Hezbollah. At my count, that's 19 so far, and has destroyed their entire chain of command. Now, these guys knew Israel was hunting them, so they were very well hidden. I mean, really well, like concrete bunkers 60 feet below the surface. And Israel found them anyway. Even the leader of Hezbollah, they were able to assassinate all of them. Israel had also said that there would be a ground assault, which there was. Israel sent ground troops into Lebanon, which is a major escalation on the road to an all-out war. So, as pretty much everyone has guessed, if you're going to do an attack like this, eventually there will be a response from someone. This week, Iran fired 200 missiles the size of school buses directly into Israel. These are those 𝗪Ｃe𝗶𝗋 ballistic missiles we've talked about. They go up above the Earth's atmosphere, then separate from the rocket and fall back to Earth and hit the target. They have warheads at around 2,645 pounds. Now, there was also a variant of that missile named the 𝗪𝗏-1, which was also used. This is a hypersonic missile, meaning it can travel about 5 times the speed of sound. This missile is also guided its trip back down to Earth, which can be done, which means it can, in some respects, avoid those defensive missiles. Now, we have discussed Israel's defensive missiles called the Iron Dome. But as for now, there are multi-stories out there on whether that missile was used, or the David Sling defense system, which goes after certain types of those Iranian missiles. There's also the Arrow missiles. Israel has a multi-layered missile defense system that can just about get anything that any enemy would shoot at it. But whatever was used a few days ago, it lit up the night sky like fireworks. And the Israeli missiles shot down just about every missile Iran sent to it. Well, almost. Some missiles did, however, break through and hit land and the ocean. One missile that missed hit the ocean with such force that the power unleashed, it smashed all the windows of a nearby building. But fortunately, no deaths of Israelis were reported from the missiles. There were some injuries from falling debris, and a Palestinian man has died, but nothing from the direct attack. But honestly, I don't think it was Iran's intention to kill many Israelis, because if it had been, there would be many dead. I mean, Iran knows about Israel's defensive system. It seems as if this was kind of a warning shot. Israel killed all the Hezbollah leadership and assassinated the head of Hamas in Iran. The Iranian government made it very clear that Iran does not seek a war with Israel. However, it warned Israel about those killings and said, even if it fired these missiles, that Israel should not enter into a conflict with Iran. Of course, Hamas praised the Iranian attack and called it heroic. They said it sent a strong message to the Zionist enemy and its fascist government to deter it from terrorism. But did it deter Israel from anything? Israel made a statement by saying any enemy that attacks Israel should expect as severe a response, to which Iran said, if you do that, then watch out, because the next attack will be even worse. Meanwhile, during this volley of threatening statements, the U.S. said, we'll support Israel, but the U.S. Secretary General who condemned this whole thing, was quoted as saying, the broadening of the Middle East conflict with escalation after escalation, this must stop. We absolutely need a ceasefire. End quote. But we have to realize and hope that Israel believes this too. Lebanon is not Iran. Iran has 3,000 ballistic missiles, so we think could be more. They have a nuclear program. It could very well have weapons of mass destruction. And then there's Hezbollah. Even they lost their leadership, they still have missiles too. Right now, Israeli troops are in Lebanon looking to destroy those missiles and kill any Hezbollah before they can fire those missiles. I mean, aren't we sure that Hezbollah is trying to figure out how to fire some of those missiles at Israel before they can destroy them all? In the meantime, the night before last, Israel lit up the night sky with massive explosions raining down outside the international airport in Beirut. Israel is telling people living in the southern Lebanon area, you need to leave your homes now. Currently, there are massive traffic jams all over the southern part of the country as people are trying to get out, trying to figure out where to go. Also in the capital, a residential building was hit, and the people from Lebanon Fire and Rescue are being killed left and right, trying to deal with all these attacks. So far, 40 paramedics and firefighters have been killed by the Israelis. The complete count is around 1,300 killed in Lebanon in just 4 days, and 1 million people are displaced. Someone asked me yesterday, why is Israel doing this? They are fighting a war in their own country. Why go after Lebanon too? Well, actually, this fight with Hezbollah has been brewing for a while now. They have been trading missiles across the border ever since Israel began attacking Gaza, which started almost exactly a year ago today. Many in Israel have had to leave their homes near the border of Lebanon because of all the rocket and missile and drone attacks coming out of Lebanon. Now, these attacks are not coming from the country of Lebanon. They are coming from Hezbollah, which has considerable power in Lebanon. I mean, as of now, Hezbollah and the IDF are fighting each other in the ground. Several Israeli soldiers have already been killed in Lebanon. Hezbollah is already claiming they have the upper hand and have been able to repel attempts by the Israeli military to advance into some border towns. And Hezbollah continues to send missiles over the border. The IDF said more than 230 projectiles have been launched into Israeli territory so far. Like I said, Hezbollah has a lot of stuff. And even if Israeli ground forces and jets were able to take out a lot of their missiles, Iran is there to resupply them. Now, the president of Israel has been asking the U.S. to please go to war against Iran and protect Israel from them and all its enemies. However, the U.S. is pleading with everyone to please stop shooting at each other. Israel is completely surrounded by its enemies, the Houthi, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. Of course, Israel has been killing Palestinian women and children, so they are not very well liked by anyone in that neighborhood. The U.S. is hated there for giving firepower and technology to Israel to be able to mount these massive military campaigns. So the Biden administration has been trying to hold Israel back at times, hoping they will take a more defensive strategy. This might be part of the reason why Netanyahu supports Trump all of a sudden. They believe that Trump will be fine with Israel attacking anyone and not worrying so much about the global public relations of it all. For instance, in the middle of all this bombing by Iran and all these attacks on Lebanon, Israel also attacked an elementary school, a high school, and an orphanage in Gaza, killing 51 people. We didn't even notice. Israel's reason for attacking schools with children inside of them is that they believe the schools were being used by Hamas to plan and carry out operations. The hospital shows that 7 women and 12 children, including toddlers, were killed in just one school. And this is all happening as we focus on the Iranian missiles, which killed no one. So people asking, why is Hamas and Hezbollah attacking Israel? Well, maybe it's because reports are showing that more women and children have been killed in just Gaza than any other war in the past 20 years. That's 6,000 women and 11,000 children were killed by the Israeli military in Gaza. It looks like Hamas started this conflict with a horrific attack that happened 1 year ago tomorrow. But in reality, Israel has been killing Palestinians for years. Sometimes it seems, as many have surmised, that Israel wants this war to develop. I shouldn't say Israel, like the people of it, but the conservative wing of the government. They need this war in order to stay in power. People say Hamas wanted Israel to retaliate against them in order to build coalitions against Israel. This is true. But Israel has done just as much facilitating as Hamas. Both are extremists. Both fall under the definition of what is a terrorist, and both are trying to protect their people. You think I'm the only one to figure all this out? And unfortunately, both wants the other to die. Can there ever be peace between them? The answer is no. At least not with the current leaders anyway. And the current leader of Israel is picking fights with anyone and everyone. Will the U.S. enter this war, which started as a civil conflict and now is a regional conflict? Will Russia step in to back its friend Iran? Who will Saudi Arabia get behind? Well, whoever will benefit them. And what's Iraq's role going to be in all this? This is the world we live in now. Everyone wants to fight. Well, the leaders do anyway. In the end, those are the only ones that really win these things. This is LeCain on the World News Jam, right here on DZRJ. Racism. Something we generally connect to the United States. Mostly a white person treating a black person or a Latino person or an Asian person in a bad way only because of their ethnic background, i.e. the color of their skin. I mean, this has been going on in the world since the beginning of human existence. We tend not to like people who are not like us, whether it's our skin color, religion, language, social class. There's all kinds of discrimination in this world. But today we are looking at the type of racism among Asians. There was an incident just recently in China in which a 10-year-old Japanese boy was stabbed about 200 meters from his Japanese school in Xinjiang, China. He later died of his wounds. The apparent reason for the killing was that the boy was Japanese. Immediately, the Prime Minister of Japan said this was a despicable crime and urged the Chinese government to protect Japanese people living in China. Now, a spokesman for the Chinese ministry called it an isolated incident and said it could have happened anywhere. But that's something that seems to be the question. It could have happened anywhere, but it happened in China. And the boy was killed just for the sole reason that he was Japanese. Because many Chinese people just don't like Japanese people. And to make matters more worse, it happened on the anniversary of the 9/18 incident that happened back in 1931 when a Japanese-owned railway was blown up by the Chinese and became the pretext for the invasion of Japan into China. Now, in reality, it was the Japanese that detonated a small quantity of dynamite near the train tracks, which virtually made no damage. But the Japanese still blamed it all on Chinese dissidents and brought in the military to protect Japanese interests. China has never really forgotten that invasion of its country by the Japanese. In fact, state media and officials urged the public to never forget the national humiliation the Japanese brought on China at that time. This has been one of the causes being blamed for the rise in anti-Japanese sentiment. There was an attack just a few months ago before in which a Chinese man stabbed a woman and her child in front of their school. A Chinese bus driver tried to help that woman and ended up dying in the incident himself. Japanese officials have formally asked the government to watch over the Japanese schools on the 9/18 anniversary, and now a 10-year-old boy is dead. Speaking of anti-Japanese sentiment, goes all the way back to 2012 when many Chinese protested Japan over certain islands in the East China Sea. Chinese officials never allow protests, ever. However, they somewhat approved these protests. The Japanese embassy was taken over by angry protesters who took over the building by force and held it for a while. Besides that, they ransacked restaurants and smashed Japanese cars. This happened in multiple cities across China. This incident at the school happened in Xinjiang, which is a home to some 3,600 Japanese. And of course, those Japanese are shocked and angry and demanding answers. These recent racial outlashes against Japanese schools is maybe because of the building rumors that Japanese schools are basically just to train future spies. Now, the Chinese social media platforms have begun to crack down on online hate speech against Japanese by shutting down accounts that promote such language, but still, it can be seen online very easily. Some have even spread the idea maybe the Chinese were responsible for directing and staging the attack on the young boy. I mean, I can see how people might be wary of Japanese living in their country. They have spent their lives studying the horrors of the Japanese military that were committed on the Chinese during their occupation. And then there's the islands that both China and Japan have laid claim to, and the fact that Japan and the U.S. militaries are closely working together against China. China is trying to assert itself as the dominant military power in Asia, maybe the world. But Japan has recently stepped up its game, raising its military budget dramatically over the past several years, raised the bar on direct battle technology, and the main purpose? To combat China. If you continue to hear how bad the Japanese are to your country day in and day out, eventually, well, it takes its toll on the population. The Chinese Communist Party decides what people will see and read and hear. In social media in China, the CCP pushes their ultra-nationalistic agenda, which is full of anti-American, anti-Japanese language. It's a constant reminder of the war and how people should remember and teach the history the way the Chinese remember it. So when you are bombarded with posts every day like this, the hatred starts to build toward the Japanese communities and eventually Japanese schools. A teacher in a Chinese school said they always portray Japanese people as the villain in every story. This is not that different to the Israelis and the Palestinians. They learn in school from an early age that one or the other is an inferior human and should be feared. They look very similar, but yet very different. The Jews in Germany in 1940, it's a good example. They have similar features, the Germans and the Jews, yet each looks at the other as completely ugly. Chinese and Japanese at a distance, or even close, share very similar features in terms of hair color, eye color, skin color, yet both refer to the other as a completely different race of people. But one thing is clear, the Japanese have always been a very peaceful country after the U.S. forced them into submission with a couple of those nuclear bombs. And they realized that the Chinese dominance in Asia is on their doorstep, and this poses a major threat to the Japanese. It doesn't help that the overall Chinese population sees them as a villainous race of people that cause great pain and suffering to the Chinese. And it comes down to picking a side. Japan will most definitely never come down on the side of China, especially now that a young 10-year-old school child is dead. Just goes to show that how we are brought up is how we will be in life. If you were taught to hate as a child, then you will hate as an adult. And you will teach your children, and they will teach their children. This is something we need to overcome as human beings one day, because that day might just be the downfall of us all. And this is Eric LeCain on the World News Jam on Radio Bandito TV. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm happy to get to some space news here on the show today. And one of my favorite things to update you on is those Voyager spaceships. You know, there's two ships, Voyager 2 and the Voyager 1. I put them in that order because number 2 was launched in August of 1977 and number 1 in September of 1977. They did this because, as it turned out, the course of number 2 needed the planets to be in a certain alignment, which fell a month before the ship number 1. Anyway, 47 years they have been traveling out into space. Currently, Voyager 1 is around 15 billion miles away, and Voyager 2 is around 13 billion miles away. They're meant to study our solar system and send back data and then drift out of existence, but they have achieved far more than what we expected, because they have been able to travel nearly out of our solar system and yet still able to send back information. Now, you also have to realize these ships were built in 1977, before phones and personal computers and terabyte drives you put in your pocket. Cell phones, I meant. This is old technology floating in the farthest reaches of the known space, and it's still working. Well, kinda. This week, NASA finally decided to power down the part of Voyager 2 that measures solar winds. This past week, using the Deep Space Network, which is a series of radio antenna that can beam information billions of miles through space, they shut down that instrument and it will not be used again. By the way, it takes 19 hours to send a message to one of those ships and 19 hours to get one back. You know, when you're out 13 billion miles. The reason to do this shutdown is to save power, keep the spaceship in communication with Earth well into the 2030s. Did I tell you it was never supposed to work that long? But it is. That's just amazing, I think. The ship is powered by plutonium, which is a consistent source of power that can last, obviously, for decades. However, even plutonium has a lifespan, and this super battery is running out. There are 3 radioisotopic thermoelectric generators that convert heat emitted from the plutonium into electricity, and that's basically how the whole thing keeps operating. Now, they have been turning off instruments one by one, but they keep them on as long as possible because the data they are been transmitting back is something that is just a one-time only thing. I mean, these ships are currently operating in interstellar space, which is outside of the heliosphere, the area that our sun encompasses. It protects our solar system from interstellar radiation. In other words, if it were not there, we would not be here. So the ship is beyond this. Before, they had been able to send data on the stream of ions and electrons coming from the sun's hot outer atmosphere, and it could tell us how far and intense these solar winds are at a distance. But now the Voyager is beyond interstellar space, and the amount of data that's possible to collect from the sun is limited or none. So they're just going to turn all those instruments off. Meanwhile, Voyager 1 took about 7 months off recently. For a while, scientists thought they might have completely lost communication with the ship forever. The probe got caught up in some kind of loop. It was sending back a repeating pattern over and over and over again. It had, in what scientific terms are, a glitch billions of miles away using 1977 technology. However, they figured out a clever way to get the probe to unglitch and reestablish communications after 7 months between 2023 and 2024, which they had nothing. But the problem was then that none of the instruments on board were working properly anymore either. Here again, scientists were in fear that even though they could communicate, they could no longer get any data. But last May, they figured out a command. They sent it to the spacecraft and the instruments started working again. But how they were able to do this was absolutely ingenious. Turns out that there was this corrupted chip, the one that they had to take out that was on board, and this held, the computer software code. Obviously, they can't fix the chip, so they decided to move the information elsewhere on the ship. The problem was there was nowhere else big enough to store it. Remember, 1977 technology? So they split it up, putting it into different parts, the codes in different parts and places in the ship. A little bit here, a little bit there. Anyway, just to note, Voyager 2 also lost communication in 2023 as well. What happened there was the antenna got pointed in the wrong direction. They used something called a high-powered shout, which got the spaceship turned around in the right direction, but it took some time to figure out the correct shout. But as things go in deep space, the fact that these ships are even still working at all is amazing. And even more amazing is they are sending back info from an area so far away that until recently we couldn't even imagine. But the most interesting thing is that these ships will most likely outlive us. There's nothing to stop them from continuing through the path they are on, even without any power, and after humankind has disappeared, or at least after the earth is burned up, which it will eventually. Now, granted, that's a long, long time from now, and hopefully we'll have developed space travel by then so the humans can continue to exist, maybe getting out there past even where the two Voyagers are now. But until that time, a piece of tech built in 1977 will continue on its travels into deep space, even without us driving it. This is Eric LeCain on the World News Jam, talking about some space news here on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV, right here in Manila, Philippines. So let's get to our continuing coverage of the U.S. election. Well, this week was the vice presidential debate. And oh, was it a barn burner? That is, if your barn was maybe the size of a doghouse, not really so much fire. And it's okay if it burns, just the doghouse. Yes, this debate was what you might call normal. Remember back when debates were normal, generally known as the pre-Trump era? Debates were where candidates were polite and didn't talk over each other and didn't throw personal insults at each other or had the need to mute the microphone just to keep the debate civil. In other words, they were boring. Yes, in the time of Trump debates, well, they're expected to be insane and packed with 10-second TikTok clips in which people can say, "Oh my God, can you believe what he just said?" Well, this debate was not that. There were very few OMG moments, and it was fairly uneventful. But these days, the actual debate is not really how we form our opinions, is it? It's the after debate. It's how the pundits on the news shows spin the debate that forms our opinions. This is the new modern way of watching presidential debates. You don't even need to watch it anymore, really. Just wait till the highlight reels and then let someone else tell you how to think and what opinions to form. If you waited for the after party on this debate, you would see how the news people took a rather dull, run-of-the-mill debate and turned it into something incredible. If you watch Fox, well, J.D. Vance wiped the floor with Tim Walz. Wasn't even a fair fight from the start. How J.D. just walked over Tim Walz. Honestly, J.D. Vance is a Yale graduate. He is a professional debater. I mean, he's right out of your high school how to debate book. But then turned the channel over to MSNBC. Tim Walz may not be the slick as J.D. Vance, but he clearly beat Vance on substance. And Tim was real and down to earth, just like you and me. Vance was just there to promote himself while Walz really cares about us. So there it is. They pretty much laid out our opinion for us. But if you actually watched the debate and paid attention, both sides were kind of right sometimes. I mean, Vance was slick and polished. He tried to make it look as if all the problems of the past 4 years are Kamala Harris's fault, almost as if she had been the president over the last 4 years. In fact, he even said the Harris-Biden administration purposely putting her name first. Now, in general, vice presidents don't really have much power in the U.S. except maybe Dick Cheney. And for the most part, we didn't even hear much about Harris after she became vice president. But J.D. used that point to push the blame on the horrible state of the country on her. In contrast, Tim Walz basically made the point that Trump does not have the temperament to be a president, that if faced with something like a war in the Middle East, he would just make things worse. Okay, this is what I expected. What I didn't expect was that J.D. Vance would be so normal. You know, usually on his podcasts and interviews, he can say something, pretty crazy. I sort of expected him to be the Trump attack dog and go for the jugular on Tim Walz, but that's not really what he was. At some points, he actually seemed nice and was coming from the candidate who was, he has the lowest approval rating of anyone currently in the race. He said at one point that Walz had some good ideas. He even agreed with him sometimes. When the issues of immigration came up, though, the subject of the fact that Vance once championed the idea of illegal Haitian immigrants that were stealing people's cats and dogs and eating them, which turned out to be completely false, no matter what video you're watching. Now, because of this accusation, there have been bomb threats flying around the city of Springfield, and has caused an enormous amount of unrest, to say the least. Walz brought this up, saying, stuff like this, there will be consequences. And he pointed out the 12 to 15,000 Haitian immigrants who live there, who are there legally and who are not eating cats and dogs. Vance pointed out that because of the influx of immigrants, schools are overwhelmed, hospitals are overwhelmed, housing is unaffordable, although I'm still not entirely sure how housing prices being high is immigrants' fault, but okay. But Walz said we could easily solve the whole problem with the border if Donald Trump was just not around to make it worse or to kill legislation that his own party came up with. Then, of course, came up the issue of abortion. Of course, now, from current polls, this is the number one issue in the country among women. And so Vance, who is part of the anti-abortion movement, was clearly walking on broken glass. He said, we have a big country and it's diverse, and California has a different viewpoint than that of Georgia. To which Walz snapped back that that's not how it works. Abortion is a basic human right. Quickly pointed out that maternal mortality has skyrocketed since places like Texas have put abortion restrictions into effect. The moderators asked Walz about Trump's assertion that he wants to legalize abortion in the 9th month of pregnancy. Now, I need to be clear. Abortion in the 9th month in the U.S. is near 0%. But instead of saying that, Walz was able to bring up some stories about women who face death due to these bans that the states are imposing. So like I said, nothing was out of the ordinary. But what we were waiting for really was one of the candidates to make that really big mistake. Like watching a car race. You watch it for hours and hours, waiting for a wreck to happen, and when it does, it's all you can talk about. Well, there were a couple of wrecks in this debate. Walz had one because once he was in China during the Tiananmen Square massacre, also known as the June 4th incident. That was in 1989. Chinese students had been protesting the Communist Party for a month and a half, I think. China deployed military troops to the area. One thing led to another, and several thousand people died, although that number has never been accurately confirmed. But Tim Walz said he was there, but he wasn't. He said he got caught up in the moment and misspoke. Actually, he was there a few months later. I mean, he did his best to clean it up, but faceplant. People thought that might have been the end of Walz, but later he was able to turn the tables and ask Vance directly if Trump lost the election in 2020. I mean, Vance had already said that Trump saved the Affordable Care Act and that Trump handed over power peacefully after the election was over. Ouch. He skirted many Trump issues during the debate, but Tim got him point blank with that, did Trump lose the election question? Vance said, well, Hillary Clinton said Trump stole the election against her in 2016 by saying Putin, bought $500,000 worth of Facebook ads, to which Walz said January 6th was not about Facebook ads. Trump lost the election. He said he didn't. 140 police officers were beaten at the Capitol that day, some with an American flag, and some later died. Vance used all his debate experience to change the subject and divert and get out of this place that he didn't want to be in. But Walz said, here again, Trump's doing the same thing he did 4 years ago. Even in the end, J.D. Vance just couldn't bring himself to say Trump lost the election. So anyway, what will this debate mean to the election? Probably really nothing. Vice presidential debates rarely do. Basically, both candidates just need to get in and get out without creating a major negative 10-second TikTok clip. And they both got out relatively unscathed. The question always asked is who won the debate? As far as this one goes, just pick which TV network to watch and they will give you the winner that you want. But for me, I'm falling on the category that most people are in. It doesn't really matter. I highly doubt that anyone is changing their mind based on this debate. Neither man won, neither man lost. In the end, they both stood on stage and shook hands with their wives and smiled. It's been a long time since we had a normal, boring debate. It was pretty nice. But let's take a look at what's not nice. I mean, in the last debate with Trump and Harris, there were bets on whether they would even shake hands, and we ended up with a TikTok moment when Harris walked over to Trump and kind of forced him to shake her hand and pronounced her name correctly to him. Heck, in the previous debate before, Trump and Biden wouldn't shake hands at all. But this is where we are as far as the U.S. election. Just a month away, and the country is more divided than ever. Each side literally hates the other. Both are really waiting for what is known as the October surprise. This October surprise is when something spectacular happens in October, just before the presidential election. In 1920, just a week before the election, it was rumored that Warren Harding, the presidential candidate, was of African descent. So they went on a campaign in the South to prove his whiteness. In 1964, on October 7th, one of President Johnson's aides was arrested for disorderly conduct in a Washington YMCA, which was notorious for a gathering of homosexuals. In 1980, in October, Jimmy Carter was preparing for a military operation to get the Iranian hostages released. His October surprise, which many believed would have won him the election. Supposedly, Ronald Reagan conspired with the Iranian government to make sure the hostages would not be released until after the election. Now, that's a story. In any case, it's now October. So, are there any surprises coming? Well, you tell me. There's a possible port strike that could run inflation through the roof. The U.S. could be dragged into a major Middle Eastern conflict. There was just a massive hurricane in the southern U.S. But these are all policy issues. What about the juicy personal issues, like in the race for governor of North Carolina, where the Republican called himself a black Nazi and said we should bring back slavery because he said he wants to buy a few. Oh, and he paid for his girlfriend's abortion. And did I mention he's a Republican? Now, that's a governor's race. In the presidential race, we are still waiting for the big bombshell. I thought it might be yesterday when Jack Smith, the special prosecutor for the Department of Justice, released his final case documents against Donald Trump. He dropped some pretty big bombs, mostly never before heard testimony from when Trump tried to overturn the last election. It seems Trump told a family member, doesn't matter if you won or lost in the election, you just still need to fight like hell. Supposedly Trump had many conversations with his vice president then, Mike Pence. Trump told Pence he needed to not certify the election, that they had a plan to overthrow the government. But Pence refused to do the things Trump asked him to do. Trump said, if you don't do this, hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate your guts and people are going to think you are stupid. He also told Pence, you are too honest. In the filings from this week, it said that on the morning of January 6th, Trump talked to Pence again and pressured him to not certify the election, but Pence refused again. So Trump went to plan B, sent a crowd to the congressional building. The crowd went there to kill Mike Pence, screaming, hang Mike Pence, and where is Pence, and traitor Pence. And they got a call from the Pence Secret Service detail that Pence was in trouble. They had to move him to a basement. Trump's reaction was, so what? It was after this that Trump made his infamous tweet that Pence had let down his country. Once the prosecutor is trying to show here is that Trump was not acting in the capacity as president, but rather a desperate person trying to, any way possible, overthrow an election. In any other year, this story might be a major October surprise, enough to kill a campaign. But as of now, it's just another normal day. People of the U.S. have become so immune to these types of stories, it's nothing more than just a blip on the radar. Meanwhile, Harris must figure out how she is going to deal with this problem in the Middle East. Right now, Trump is saying this war would have never happened if he was president. Most likely he will capitalize on this issue, especially if the war keeps getting worse. No matter how you slice it, with the involvement of Iran, the U.S. is going to have to do something. Can Harris and Biden pull off peace in the Middle East in a month? No, probably not. They just have to not screw it up too badly and give Trump the ammo that he wants so much. I mean, Trump and Netanyahu are pretty well aligned in their thinking. Trump right now doesn't want peace of any kind in the Middle East. In fact, with this invasion by Israel in Lebanon, Trump is hoping all policies for peace fail right now. And in the middle of all this, a strike on the major ports of America. 50,000 members were set to walk off the job. Biden said that even if this can create a downturn in the economy, he's not going to stop it. Instead, he will try collective bargaining as a peaceful bargaining chip. But this is not going to be easy. These guys running these ports want some of that massive profitability that the shipping firms are making. This is some good ammo for the Trump, even though Trump has clearly been against organized labor from the start. But for now, that strike has been averted with a tentative deal, kinda. Trump claimed Biden was sleeping on the job while the hurricanes devastated the South, that the governor of Georgia couldn't get through to President Biden. Of course, it turns out that the governor could indeed get through to the president, and he offered to do anything to help. So Trump did actually lie about that, and the Republican governor said he was lying. But as we know, it's not a lie if people believe it. And this one will have an impact. Here again, most of this is probably not going to change anyone's mind about who they're going to support, but it could change some people's mind if they're going to vote at all. If Republicans in the South think that Harris and Biden have forgotten them, then maybe they will show up to vote. You know, in the U.S., only about 60% of the population actually votes. Many people talk a big game, but then they don't show up to vote. The election is currently shaping up to be razor close, and there needs to be a really big October surprise to tilt the scales one way or the other. The funny thing is, if there is anything that would surprise anyone anymore in this election, really, well, October still has about 4 weeks left, so we will just wait and see. This is the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. I'm 𝗪cie𝗿𝗀. Thank you so much for joining our discussion on this week's world news events. Please join us next week right here on the Jam on DZRJ. So until then, be safe out there, and we will see you next week.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.